Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to dig into some history.
Today, we're tackling a topic that frankly blew my mind a little bit when I started prepping, the Korean War.
Ah, yes, the Forgotten War.
Right, but as we're about to find out, it's anything but forgotten when you see the impact it had. You, our awesome listeners, sent in a lecture transcript designed for, get this, IBDP history students. I thought I knew a thing or two about the Korean War.
Full surprises.
You're telling me. We're talking shockwaves that hit U.S. politics, the civil rights movement, the entire Cold War going global. Seriously, buckle up. I have a feeling this is going to be a wild ride.
Well, that's the thing, right? Most folks, they get caught up in the battles themselves. Important, sure, but it's the ripple effect that's really fascinating, how the Korean War touched everything, from U.S. elections to, well, to the rise of China, really.
Okay, so let's break it down. First off, how did a war happening all the way over in Korea rock American politics back home? You'd think it'd be too far away to matter that much, right?
You'd think distance would buffer things, but not this time. Think about President Truman. Rides high on ending World War II, hero status.
Makes sense. Ending a world war, gotta give you some political capital.
Right. But fast forward to the Korean War dragging on. His approval ratings tanked.
Whoa, seriously, I mean, what went wrong?
Well, Truman goes into Korea aiming for the knockout punch, right? Quick win, decisive, show the commies who's boss.
Strong message.
Exactly. Except the war stalled. Stalemate. American lives, American money pouring in, but no clear victory, and the public not having it.
Yeah, I can see how that wouldn't exactly be a winning campaign strategy.
And you know who saw their chance? The Republicans. Eisenhower's 52 campaign literally used Korea as their attack. Corruption, communism, and Korea. That was their slogan.
No way. They basically weaponized a war to take down the Democrats.
Exactly. And it worked. That inability to get a clean win in Korea, that's what stuck to Truman, tarnished his image, helped put Eisenhower in the White House. Textbook example of how a war oceans away can decide elections.
Okay, that is mind-blowing. Who knew the Korean War was playing kingmaker back in the U.S.? But hold on, this lecture transcript you sent, it also talks about something positive coming out of this mess. Desegregation of the military? How'd that happen?
This is where it gets really interesting. So Truman had already signed this thing, Executive Order 9981, calling for equality in the armed forces, right?
Okay, so on paper, good intentions, but...
But it's the Korean War that puts it to the test. Real-world test.
Ah, so not just words anymore, it's playing out in the trenches.
Literally, for the first time, you have large-scale integrated units, black soldiers, white soldiers, side by side, proving themselves in combat.
So the war kind of forced America to live up to its ideals, at least in the military.
It did, and it made a huge difference. Challenged the racism of the time, laid the groundwork for the whole civil rights movement. Integration wasn't some theory anymore. It was proven to work.
Wow, it's almost ironic, right? A war meant to stop communism ends up pushing America toward equality. History is wild.
Full of twists, that's for sure. But we're just scratching the surface here. We've talked U.S. politics, but the Korean War's impact on the global Cold War, that's a whole other story. It cranked up the tension worldwide and spread it way beyond Europe.
Okay, so let's get into that. What were the big changes on the world stage we need to understand?
Imagine this. The Korean War took the Cold War, and it was like hitting the fast-forward button. Suddenly, it's not just about Europe anymore. Asia becomes a major battleground. U.S. versus Soviet Union, round two.
So like that domino effect everyone was worried about.
Exactly, and you see it play out in the rise of Brinkmanship under Eisenhower, a strategy born out of, well, fear, really. Fear of the Soviets, fear of China.
Brinkmanship. Doesn't sound like a relaxing afternoon stroll in the park.
Oh, it wasn't. Imagine a terrifying game of chicken. But instead of cars, it's nuclear war. The idea was if America shows it's willing to go to the brink, push it to the limit.
Oh, man.
The Soviets wouldn't risk a full-blown conflict.
They were playing with nuclear war. Talk about high stakes.
High stakes indeed. In the Korean War, that provided the context. The fear of communism spreading after Korea, that's what made this crazy strategy seem like the only option to some.
I guess it's hard for us to truly grasp how intense that fear was back then, but did this brinkmanship thing even work?
That's still debated. Some say, yeah, it prevented a direct superpower showdown. Others argue, nope, it just made the world a much more dangerous place.
Yeah.
Either way, it shows you how the Korean War totally changed how the Cold War was played.
Okay, so we've got this escalation happening. What else is going on globally?
Well, for one, West Germany joins NATO.
Wait, Germany? I thought we were talking about Asia.
Remember the Cold War, it's like a global chessboard. The Korean War, it dialed up the fear of the Soviets everywhere, including Europe, bringing West Germany into NATO. That was seen as essential to bolster Western Europe's defenses.
Okay, but wouldn't that just poke the Soviet bear even more?
It definitely did. Increased tensions, solidified the division of Germany, Europe as a whole, like drawing a line in the sand, East versus West.
So things are heating up on multiple fronts, and then there's this super secret document you mentioned earlier, NSC 68.
Ah, yes, NSC 68. This policy paper calling for a huge increase in U.S. military spending. It was already in the works, but the Korean War, that was like giving it the green light. Go, go, go.
So Korea basically gave them the excuse to pour money into defense.
More than an excuse. It created this sense of urgency. It was like, we need to be ready for a global showdown with communism, and we need to be ready now. NSC 68, it shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades, made military might the cornerstone of their Cold War strategy.
So it wasn't just a regional conflict, it was like a catalyst for how America viewed its role in the world.
Exactly, and that new way of thinking extended to forging new alliances. Take SEATO, for example, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization.
Okay, another acronym. Break it down for me.
Imagine mini NATO, but in Southeast Asia. It brought together Thailand, the Philippines, Pakistan, along with the U.S., U.K., France, all united against the spread of communism.
So basically, America was weaving this web of alliances to try and contain the communist bloc.
You can say that. The Korean War, it showed them how vital it was to have allies in key spots, ready to push back against communism. And it wasn't just SEATO, there were other partnerships getting a major boost during this time.
You're talking Japan and Taiwan, right?
Exactly. U.S. signs a peace treaty with Japan, keeps military bases there, made Japan a key ally in Asia, and then there's Taiwan.
What happened with Taiwan?
U.S. pledged to defend Taiwan against mainland China, recognized it as the legitimate government of China, isolated mainland China on the world stage.
It's wild how all these events, they seem unrelated to Korea at first, but they're actually tied together by this war.
That's the thing about history. It's all connected. And these connections, they become super clear when we look at the road to Vietnam.
Okay, now we're getting into a whole other story. What's the link between Korea and Vietnam?
The Korean War, it cemented America's commitment to containing communism in Asia and Vietnam, seen as the next domino about to fall.
You're saying America's involvement in Vietnam was a direct result of what happened in Korea?
In a lot of ways, yes. At first, the U.S. just supported the French in their fight against the Viet Minh. But when France lost, U.S. stepped in. They saw it as part of their mission to stop communism from spreading.
And it all stemmed from those fears and policies that came out of the Korean War. It's like a chain reaction.
Precisely. And it wasn't just Vietnam. U.S. supported other anti-communist regimes in Asia, too, doubling down on their commitment to the region. This had a lasting impact, shaping how the U.S. dealt with Asia for decades.
Okay, my head is spinning. We started with a lecture about the Korean War, and now we're talking Vietnam, global alliances. It's like everything's connected.
And that's just the beginning. But here's the thing. Even today, historians are still arguing about what the Korean War really means, its true legacy.
Wait, really? So there's no clear answer on how it all played out?
Not exactly. There are a few different schools of thought. You've got the Orthodox view. They see the Korean War as, well, a necessary evil. Had to stop communism no matter what.
So the U.S. as the good guy fighting the good fight.
That's the gist of it. Then you've got the revisionists. They're much more critical.
What's their take?
They argue the U.S. overreacted, got tangled up in a conflict they could have avoided, needlessly expanded the Cold War.
So it was more about American interests than saving the world.
That's their argument. Then you've got the post-revisionists. They try to find some middle ground.
A more nuanced approach.
Exactly. They acknowledge the threat of communism was real, but they also highlight how U.S. involvement backfired. Say it militarized American foreign policy, created a more dangerous world.
Okay, so we've got the good guys, the bad guys, and the it's complicated folks. Any other viewpoints?
Oh yeah, there's the new left view. They focus on how America basically acted like an empire. Say the Korean War was more about the U.S. maintaining its power than protecting anyone's freedom.
So they see it as an example of American imperialism.
That's the core of their argument.
Yeah.
They point to the U.S. supporting some pretty nasty dictatorships in Asia as evidence.
Wow, so many different interpretations of the same event.
That's what makes history so fascinating, right? Always more to learn, more to question, more to debate.
My mind is officially blown. Who knew the Korean War had such a huge and complex impact? It's like everything I thought I knew about history just got flipped on its head.
And we're just getting started. We haven't even touched on how Korea itself was transformed, how it impacted China's rise, or the shadow it cast on international relations.
Hold on, I need a minute to process all this.
Don't worry, we've got plenty of time to dive into all those fascinating details. But for now, let's take a moment to let everything sink in. You know, it's interesting how all those different ways of looking at the Korean War we talked about, they still matter today.
You mean like the whole Orthodox versus revisionist thing? How does that apply to, like, now?
Well, think about how we view conflicts today. When countries intervene, you know, are they the good guys defending democracy? Or is it about, like, economics, politics, hidden agendas? It's a question we're always asking.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like we're trying to figure out America's place in the world, and those same arguments from Korea, they're still going on.
Exactly. The Korean War, it's like this cautionary tale. Reminds us to really look at why military action happens. Think about the long-term consequences, because it's not always what it seems.
It's easy to get caught up in the moment, right? But history shows us there are always unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And the Korean War, prime example. It also reminds us history isn't just dates and battles. It's understanding how those events shape the world we live in right now.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, but let's get back to some specifics. We were talking about how Korea paved the way for U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
Right. And the U.S. approach in Vietnam, heavily influenced by what they thought they learned in Korea. Or maybe misinterpreted.
Misinterpreted, what do you mean?
So in Korea, the U.S. military, they fought to a standstill. Basically contained communist expansion. But there was this huge GE pressure to win, you know, politically from the public.
Like they had unfinished business.
Yeah, kind of. That, PLUS, the whole domino theory that if one country falls to communism, others will follow. It all went into their Vietnam strategy.
So they went into Vietnam thinking they had to win, no matter what.
It was complicated, but yeah, there was this feeling they couldn't let another country go communist. And they were willing to spend a lot to prevent that.
And we know that led to a long, costly war.
A war that, in many ways, had the same problems as Korea. Tough enemy, tough terrain, and back home. People getting more and more unhappy.
Sounds like they were repeating the same mistakes.
History often rhymes, right?
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't repeat exactly.
Yeah.
And the parallels between Korea and Vietnam, striking.
Okay, so we see that direct link. What about the bigger picture? Korea's impact on U.S. foreign policy in Asia overall.
The Korean War, it basically set the stage for a more militaristic U.S. foreign policy in Asia. The idea that America had to stop communism no matter what, that really took hold.
So it justified all sorts of action.
Yeah. The U.S. started giving military aid, economic aid, to tons of anti-communist regimes in Asia, intervening in conflicts, keeping a huge military presence there.
Like Korea became the model for how to deal with Asia for decades.
Pretty much. It had good and bad consequences.
Yeah.
Helped stabilize some countries, maybe prevented communism from spreading, but also led to the U.S. supporting some pretty bad dictators, getting involved in some messy situations.
Complicated legacy for sure. But what about China? We haven't talked much about them.
China's involvement in the Korean War, that was a huge turning point for them, too.
Remind me, what was their role again?
Well, when U.S. and UN forces got close to the Chinese border, China jumped in, sent hundreds of thousands of troops, stopped North Korea from being totally defeated, pushed the front lines back.
So they were a major player. How did it affect them after the war?
It solidified China's position as, well, a communist power you can't ignore,
Yeah.
and a rival to the U.S., but it also led to them being isolated from the rest of the world.
Why isolated? They were in the war, right?
Yeah, but the U.S. still said Taiwan was the real China, actively worked to keep China from being recognized internationally. That really hurt their economy and political development.
It's interesting how the war shaped China's relationships with both the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Totally. It strengthened their ties with the Soviets at that time, but it also kind of set the stage for future problems between them. Competition.
So even the communist bloc wasn't all buddy-buddy.
Nope. The Korean War shows you just how complex the Cold War was. So many different countries, different goals, not black and white at all.
It seems like everything about the Korean War is more complicated than it looks at first.
That's the beauty of history, isn't it? The deeper you dig, the more you realize how connected everything is.
And how much we can learn from it. Okay, so we've covered the U.S., Vietnam, China, the Cold War as a whole. But what about Korea itself? How did the war shape the Korean Peninsula?
Well, the most obvious thing is the division. It's still divided. The war made that border between North and South permanent. Two separate countries, totally different systems.
So even though the fighting stopped in '53, the war never really ended.
Not really. No peace treaty. They're technically still at war.
That's intense. Over 70 years of that.
It's had a huge impact on Koreans. North Korea, under a dictatorship, has struggled economically, isolated from the world. South Korea, amazing economic growth, became a democracy, but always under threat from the North.
It's like two completely different worlds right next to each other.
And that line, the Korean War drew it.
So we see how the war's legacy is still shaping millions of lives. It's not just the past, it's still happening.
Absolutely. The echoes of history are everywhere. And understanding them, that can help us deal with today's world.
This has really opened my eyes. It's amazing how a 3-year war could have such a lasting impact.
It shows you the power of history to shape entire countries, people's lives.
You know what's blowing my mind? We started with this lecture focused on one thing, but the more we dig, the more connections pop up. The Cold War, Vietnam, China's rise, it's like one thread leads to a whole tapestry.
That's what we do here on the Deep Dive, right? Take those pieces of info, reveal those connections. The Korean War, it's a perfect example. Those connections are way bigger than anyone imagined back then. Even events that seem settled in the past, they can still influence us today.
I'm with you on that. So for everyone listening, have you ever thought, what if the Korean War had gone differently? What would Asia look like? The U.S. and Soviet Union? These are questions historians are still debating, and they can lead to some really fascinating insights.
And those insights can help us understand what's happening NW, the U.S. and China, new powers rising, the whole debate about getting involved in other countries' conflicts. The Korean War is still part of that conversation.
It's all connected. History isn't just the past. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world today and tomorrow, too.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's amazing, isn't it, how much we've uncovered about the Korean War. And we haven't even scratched the surface of everything.
Seriously. I'm still trying to wrap my head around those connections to Vietnam, China, the whole Cold War. It's crazy how one event can have such a huge ripple effect.
It really is. And, you know, what's interesting is that we often miss some of the less obvious but equally important consequences of the war.
Oh, like what?
Well, for instance, did you know that the Korean War played a huge role in shaping international institutions, like the rules of the game on a global scale?
Now you've got me curious.
Think about this. The Korean War was the first major military action taken by the United Nations.
The UN?
Yeah, it was a real test for that whole idea of collective security. Like, can countries work together to stop aggression?
So it was like the UN's first big exam.
Right.
See if they could handle a global crisis.
Exactly. And to be honest, it wasn't perfect. The Korean War showed how tough these interventions can be. Lots of challenges.
Well, to be fair, the UN was pretty new back then. They were still figuring things out.
True. But the war forced them, and the whole world, to think about some tough questions. Like, when is it okay for countries to intervene in other countries' affairs? What about using force? Those debates, they still matter today.
It's amazing how this so-called forgotten war shaped the world we live in.
Right. It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened a long time ago. It's still shaping things and now W.
Okay, so we've talked politics, diplomacy. What about the cultural impact in Korea and the U.S.?
That's another fascinating piece of the puzzle. In Korea, the war transformed society, especially in the South. Millions of people displaced, cities growing rapidly, and this blending of traditional Korean culture with American influence.
So a time of huge upheaval and change.
Exactly. And you can still see that blend of cultures in South Korea today. It's part of who they are.
What about that in the U.S.?
Well, it didn't have the same impact as World War II, but it definitely ramped up anti-communist feelings. The whole Cold War anxiety.
Ah, the Red Scare. Not exactly America's finest hour.
The Korean War fueled those fears, no question. Worries about communists sneaking in, trying to undermine things, led to some pretty bad stuff, honestly. And it also showed up in pop culture, movies, books, TV shows, reflecting those Cold War tensions.
It's like these historical events that get inside our heads, right? Shape how we see the world, even if we don't realize it.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And the Korean War, a perfect example. It's still shaping our understanding of how countries interact, global rules, the whole legacy of the Cold War.
Wow. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. It all started with a lecture about one war, but it's clear that the impact goes way beyond that.
Right. And that's what makes history so captivating. It's full of surprises, contradictions, and lessons we're still learning.
Couldn't agree more. The Korean War, despite being forgotten, has a lot to teach us about today's world. So, as you go about your day, think about this. What if things had gone differently in Korea? How would the world be different? And what other forgotten events might be shaping our lives in ways we haven't even considered? Keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and keep learning. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.